And there we are. So my talk this morning, the theme is the Benedictines in Suffolk, and we're going to do a historical survey really of the entire history of Benedictine monasticism in this one corner of England. And Suffolk is a particularly interesting case because we have a high degree of continuity of Benedictine monasticism here, right from the earliest days of the introduction of the rule of St. Benedict to England through to the present day. This is a significant year, 2021, because it will see the retirement of Father Charles at Bungay and the end of that Benedictine mission, although as I understand, St. Bennettminster will continue to be a Benedictine church. So the continuity of Benedictine monasticism in Suffolk does continue even now. But it is a watershed that we're approaching, the end of the Bungay mission, which is a significant event, given that that is one of the oldest missions in the history of the entire Catholic Church in England and Wales, let alone the English Benedictine congregation. But you'll notice also next to St. Bennettminster, I've put a reconstructed image here of the greatest of all the Benedictine monastic churches in Suffolk and indeed in England, which was Bury St. Edmunds. So we're going to look at the greats, the well-known abbeys like Bury, but we're also going to look at some of the lesser-known Benedictine houses. And Suffolk's a good example, not just because of the continuity, not just because of the connection with Downside in more recent centuries, but also because it was a county with an extraordinary number of religious houses. And so it's a snapshot, if you like, of medieval England and of the economy of monasticism, or the ecology of monasticism, if you want to look at it that way. I'm a firm believer that monastic houses can't be looked at as individual institutions. They are interacting with other institutions around them. They form part of an entire environment, a monastic environment spread across a geographical area. So that's something that I'll be looking at. This talk is based on my book, Monasticism in Suffolk, which came out in March 2020, and it came out just in time for the pandemic. And in fact, we did have a launch event at St. Edmund's Church in Bungay, kindly hosted by Father Charles. And it was really the last event that I was involved in before everything shut down. Certainly the last time that I shook anybody's hand or met anybody in person for a very, very long time after that. And then unfortunately, the publisher that published the book wound up because my publisher sadly died. And so very quickly after the book was published, it went out of print. But I've just been discussing with Steve whether we might be able to get a few of the remaining copies into the shop at Downside Abbey. And that, of course, has an online bookshop. So it may well be, if we sort that out, that some of these books will be on sale in the near future, I hope. But let's begin by looking at the origins of Benedictine monasticism in Suffolk. And to do that, we need to turn to the arrival of St. Felix in Suffolk. St. Felix of Burgundy is invited to the Kingdom of East Anglia by King Sigebert. Sigebert is the nephew of King Radwold, who's probably best known as being the likely warrior who's buried in Mound 1 at Sutton Hoo with the incredible Sutton Hoo treasure. Radwold has a checkered relationship with Christianity. He is baptized by the early missionaries, so goes to Canterbury, ostensibly accepts the Christian faith, but continues to maintain an altar to Woden, according to Bede, so not really a sincere follower of the new faith. And he is not someone who manages to establish the Christian faith on a firm footing in East Anglia, but his nephew Sigebert, who returns from exile in Gaul after a period of internecine fighting between Radwold's sons and nephews, returns in 627. And it's at this point that East Anglia can truly be said to become a Christian kingdom, because Sigebert establishes 2 monasteries, the first of which he invites Felix of Burgundy, a noted teacher, to establish a monastery at a place called Dummock, and a second one he establishes at an unnamed location. Traditionally, the location of Dummock has been identified as Dunwich on the Suffolk coast. However, there are quite a lot of scholars who think that that may not be correct, so we don't really know. And we also have the establishment of this other monastery personally by Sigebert And the traditional site for that is Bury St Edmunds, before it was, long before it was associated with St Edmund, of course. Now, we don't have very much evidence for these early sites. It's unlikely, however, that the Benedictine rule was being followed at these sites, so we can't truly speak of these minsters as Benedictine. But they do provide the pattern for monastic life. We also have the establishment of Irish minsters. This artifact that you can see on the screen is the seal of Bishop Ethelwold, who was an 8th century bishop of East Anglia. And this was discovered at Eye, a village in northeast Suffolk, but it is the seal of a bishop of Dummock. Unfortunately, because it was discovered at Eye, it doesn't advance our understanding of where exactly Dummock may have been. We just know that it was somewhere on the coast, possibly Dunwich, possibly Walton Castle. I mentioned the Irish missionaries. So we have the most prominent of those Irish missionaries in Suffolk is St Ferzi. He establishes a minster at a place called Knobbersburgh. Again, we've got the difficulty that we don't exactly know where Knobbersburgh is. The one likely site that's been proposed is Burgh Castle, which is now in Norfolk, but traditionally in Suffolk, which is one of the Roman shore forts near Great Yarmouth. And it's quite probable that both Ferzi and Felix were making use of these Roman structures. There's a pattern on the east coast where the Saxon shore forts are often being reused as monastic sites, and indeed inland as well. The walled city of London ends up being turned into an early episcopal centre, simply because these Roman walls are still largely standing. They provide protection and a boundary, a monastic boundary and precinct wall. But again, clearly we can't talk about Ferzi as being a Benedictine. But somebody that we can speak of as being a Benedictine is St Botolph. The early lives of St Botolph specifically say that Botolph introduced the rule of St Benedict for the first time to England. And Botolph was, of course, located in Suffolk. And this is the remarkable site of his monastery, a place called Aiken, Aikenhew, in the Old English language, Ikenhoe, as it's known in his early lives. And the church is still there, very likely on the same site that Botolph built it. It's in that rather strange estuarine part of Suffolk, down near towards Ipswich, where you've got the sea coming in these great tidal inlets. And Aiken is located on one of those, although the sea level probably would have been a bit higher at the time that Botolph was there. And Botolph, we know, arrives there in the 7th century, late 7th century, and banishes the demons from the island and establishes his monastery, very much like the story of St Guthlac at Crowland in Lincolnshire. Very, very strong commonalities between those two hagiographies. And we know that this is the site because although for many years it was unclear whether Aiken had any real connection with St Botolph, simply the church dedication is to St Botolph, it was mere speculation. In the 1970s, the archaeologist Stanley West found this remarkable high cross, which was embedded into the walls of the medieval church, the later medieval church at Aiken. And although this cross is from a slightly later period than Botolph's monastery, clearly it's the kind of cross that would have marked a very significant site, a very significant shrine, and it has been interpreted plausibly, in my view, as a monument to Botolph. And so I think we can be pretty much certain that Aiken really is the site of St Botolph's monastery. St Botolph, of course, spreads interest in Benedictine monasticism throughout 7th century England, and Aiken becomes the centre of a significant cult, and St Botolph dedications now spread throughout the country. In many ways, Botolph is, from the 7th century, I'd say he's the most significant of all Suffolk saints, most significant of all East Anglian saints in terms of his popularity throughout England and throughout Northern Europe. Only really eclipsed once we get towards St Edmund in the 9th century. But then we have the period of the Viking invasions, and we don't know the state of Benedictine monasticism in Suffolk, to what extent the rule of St Benedict was being followed by the time the Vikings arrive in the year 865. But we know that the great Viking army passes through East Anglia, goes up into the Midlands and the north, ravages and takes over the Midlands and the north, and comes back in the winter of 869. What follows is very well known. The king of East Anglia, Edmund, confronts the Danes at their camp at Thetford, fights them, loses, and after the battle, he is martyred by being used as target practice with arrows by the invading Danes. his body is then decapitated and the head thrown into the undergrowth, the body cast aside, and then we have the miraculous reuniting of the head and the body, the construction of a little chapel there, and the beginnings of the cult of St. Edmund. And the cult of St. Edmund is something that I've written a great deal about on, but at this point I'll just say that it's not simply the death of one king. It is a cult which is so significant and so powerful that it manages over the subsequent decades to unite the two peoples of East Anglia, the English and the Danes, into a single cultural unit. It manages to give an identity, a Christian religious identity, to the entire Danelaw, and it plays an absolutely crucial role in the unification of England and the formation of an English national identity, a sort of Anglo-Danish post-invasion English national identity. That's something which you can read about in my book about St. Edmund. At this point, though, it's the right moment to move on to talk about the reintroduction of Benedictine monasticism into East Anglia. And that's part of the great Benedictine reform movement of the 10th century, which is, of course, a phenomenon throughout Western Europe. But in the case of England, it coincides with the restoration of monasticism that's taking place after the unification of England under the House of Wessex, the banishment of Danish rule. And in East Anglia, of course, we have the most, or certainly with Yorkshire in the north, we have the most Danish area of the country at this point, where the church has essentially been destroyed. There's very little organization. We expect some sort of popular Christianity continuing, but there's no real diocesan structure. And so it falls to the Benedictines to put some of this back together. And the first major monastery that's founded is not in Suffolk, it's in Cambridgeshire at Ramsey. And it's from there, really, that Benedictine monasticism spreads out, and also from Ely is another key center, that Benedictine monasticism spreads out through the East Anglian earldom, as it then was, no longer by this point a kingdom. Now, the first major monastic Benedictine foundation, or the first Benedictine foundation that we know of in Suffolk, is in fact a refoundation, and that is the Abbey of Bury St. Edmunds. Now, Bury St. Edmunds initially is staffed by a group of secular clerks. They look after the incorrupt body of St. Edmund in a wooden church. And it's not until the year 1020, that's the traditional date that's given, that King Canute decides that he's going to found a monastery. That monastery is founded on the day of the anniversary of his defeat of King Ethelred at the Battle of Assundoun. So it could be interpreted a bit like Battle Abbey at Hastings, as a kind of thank offering monastery that is in thanks to God for that victory. It could also be interpreted as propitiation of the horrible death suffered by Canute's father, Sweyn, who of course is, according to legend, killed by St. Edmund, who appears to Sweyn as an apparition, pierces him through the heart with a lance, when Sweyn goes too far and says that he's going to tax the men of Bury St. Edmunds. And so that is another possible reason why Canute is interested in refounding the abbey. Or simply he wants a great royal abbey. He wants an association with St. Edmund, a saint who is very popular amongst Danes as well as amongst English people. So in some ways, even without all those stories, the refoundation of Bury St. Edmunds as a great Benedictine abbey, the refoundation of the shrine of St. Edmund as staffed by Benedictine monks, is something that simply makes sense from Canute's point of view. The document that you can see on the screen, this is the Bury Psalter, now in the Vatican Library. And this is the only document that we really have that describes those early days, or gives us any clue of what was happening in those early days of the abbey at Bury. So we've got there a document which gives the date of the construction of the earliest monastic church at Bury as 1032. It doesn't actually give the date 1020 for the foundation. That actually comes from a forged charter from several decades later. However, although the charter is forged, it's likely that we're looking in the right sort of chronological era for the foundation of the abbey, but we don't actually have a specific date, which is why in 2020, when the abbey was celebrating its millennium, it is a bit of a dodgy date, but it's a date that we can generally accept as being around the right sort of point, and it becomes it's a symbolic date, I suppose, that we can cling to. Now, what was that early monastery like, the first Benedictine monastery that we know of in post-Viking Suffolk? Well, what I've done here is I've overlaid a map of my own creation, which graphic design is not my strong point, but I've tried to put what Anglo-Saxon buildings we know were there on top of their locations in relation to the Abbey at its height. So we've got the grey lines, if you like, is A.B. Whittingham's map from 1951 of the Abbey as it would have appeared at the time of the Dissolution. And then on top of that, the blue squares and circles, they represent the buildings that we know were there in the Anglo-Saxon period. So we've got the River Lark running from north to south. And you'll notice that we've got two roads that are intersecting. Now, if you've ever been to Bury St Edmunds, you will no doubt have seen Churchgate Street, which is a lovely street that's got the Abbey Gateway, the Norman Abbey Gateway at the end of it. And you've also got streets that run north to south up to the precinct. But of course, the later precinct, the Norman precinct, cuts off those roads. Originally, the roads would have run right through that later precinct. We don't know what the nature of that precinct was, whether it was square, whether it was a rectangle. Probably it was completely irregular. That was often the case with Anglo-Saxon precincts. But the first church that was built is the round one, a rotunda of St Mary and St Edmund, which is built in 1032. There's a pre-existing church, St Mary's Church, which is located underneath what later becomes the south transept of the Great Norman Church. That was the church built of wood, possibly dating from as early as King Sigebert's monastery in the 7th century. Then we also have the construction of a new church sometime in the 11th century, but before the Norman conquest, St Benedict's Church. And we know the location of that because the infirmary was later built right on top of it. And then we've got another one called St Margaret's Tower, and we don't know exactly where that was, but presumably somewhere near the later site of St Margaret's Chapel, which is why I've located it down there. But what I draw your attention to here is that this early monastery is a collection of churches. It's not one big monumental church. Anglo-Saxon monasteries, rather like Russian Orthodox monasteries today, they tend to be a whole assemblage, collection of as many churches as you can afford to build, rather than focusing on this one huge central monumental church with a claustral plan. That's something that comes later. It's something that comes after the Norman conquest in England, with a few exceptions, maybe like Winchester. But yeah, it's essentially going to be quite a higgledy-piggledy arrangement, possibly not even with a monastic precinct at all. It's possible that the town is intermingled with these churches. We just don't know exactly what this early monastery was like. Although we do have some of the names of the monks from the Bury Psalter. One of my favorite bits in the Psalter is where the monks make a list of their books. So it's the earliest list of the library of Bury St Edmunds, but actually it's more their personal collections. There's no idea of an institutional library at that stage. But let's turn now to some other monasteries. So the second monastery, Benedictine house that's founded in Suffolk, is Rumbra. And this is a much more obscure house, so located in the northeast of the county. And this is around 1047, and we don't really understand very much of the early days of it at all. We just know that it was a pre-conquest foundation. But after the conquest, it becomes a cell, a dependent monastery of Saint-Melaine in Rennes, in France. And this is a common pattern. We have quite a lot of what were known later as alien priories. So those monastic houses that were actually, essentially they were dependencies of foreign monasteries, and that's something which we see quite a lot of after the conquest, and indeed for a long time after. However, by 1135, it's actually turned into a cell of St Mary's in York, and this is a very curious situation because it results in a shrine to St Bee, the saint who gave her name to St Bees in Cumbria, being enshrined in Rumbra Church in the middle of Suffolk, and so it becomes a place of pilgrimage associated with the cult of St Bee. Very, very curious house. And it's dissolved as early as 1528. We'll come across this quite a lot a bit later, that many of these smaller houses that never got above 8 to 6 monks were dissolved in the 1520s, long before Henry VIII and Thomas Cromwell comes along. And of course, the person who was dissolving those houses in the 1520s was none other than that Suffolk lad, Cardinal Wolsey, who did an enormous amount of damage to the monastic patrimony of Suffolk, for which he probably doesn't get quite enough blame, if you ask me. But let's turn to the post-conquest context now. So the Normans take control of the country. Suffolk is in a rather unusual situation at the time of the Norman conquest, because the county is divided really into two halves. West Suffolk, what we today would consider to be the western half of the county, is under the control of the Abbey of Bury. And the Abbey of Bury at that time is the personal physician of Edward the Confessor, a man called Baldwin. Baldwin is a Frenchman, so he's been the prior of a priory in Alsace. He's already been rewarded with the Church of Deerhurst, a very important church in Gloucestershire, by Edward the Confessor. He's also the man who seems to have been at Edward's deathbed and heard who it really was that Edward gave the throne to. Was it Harold? Was it William? The great unresolved question of 1066. And Baldwin becomes the personal physician of William the Conqueror. So an immensely powerful man, probably one of the most powerful men in the kingdom, and of course a Frenchman. So Bury is essentially left completely unmolested by the Normans. It retains its independence, it retains its control of the western half of Suffolk. It's as if the Norman conquest really didn't happen in Bury St Edmunds and its surrounding area. The rest of the county, however, the eastern part of it, is taken over by the Normans. A large part of it is what's known as the Liberty of St Etheldreda, so controlled by the Abbey and later Cathedral of Ely, and that, of course, is taken over by a Norman bishop. And the other monasteries all become the property of various Norman landowners and patrons. We have the earliest foundation that we know of at Eye. I've already mentioned Eye, again up in the northeast part of the county. Nearly all of the monasteries, or the smaller ones, are clustered around the Waveney Valley and around the central belt up towards the north of the county. I've never been able to establish exactly why, although of course that's the area also where the Benedictines maintained their modern continuity in the area of Bungay. But that seems to be the area where the greatest majority of the monasteries clustered. And I think partly it's to do with the land ownership around there was quite split up. And so every major landowner wanted the patronage of a religious house. That's one possible way of explaining it. I was a cell of Bernay, another French abbey. And instead of being dissolved by Cardinal Wolsey, it actually does endure until the dissolution, but it underwent a process known as denization. So the alien priories, as I've mentioned, were those priories that were controlled by a foreign house, usually French. And once the 100 Years' War breaks out, those priories are subject to dissolution. There is an act of parliament that's passed to allow their confiscation. So there is a small dissolution of the monasteries in the 14th and 15th centuries as a result of that war with France. But there was also the option for these monasteries to become denizenized, which meant that they had to apply to the crown to become English subjects. And that meant that they would either become cells of another English monastery, a greater monastery, if they couldn't afford to support themselves, or they might become completely independent houses. And so we'll see that there's a few others that also have that go through that process. Dunwich is founded around the same time as Eye, as a cell of Eye. And this is an interesting development because Dunwich at that time was the second largest town in Suffolk. The largest has always been Ipswich, but Dunwich was the second largest and a major port town. And this is clearly a case of Eye having its eye on the commercial opportunities of having a small monastic house located in a major urban centre so that it could essentially exploit the opportunities offered by trade. Unfortunately, however, as I'm sure you're all aware, Dunwich did not thrive throughout the Middle Ages, because in the 13th century, we have the collapse of most of Dunwich into the sea, and the coastal erosion continued and continues to this day, in fact. Dunwich is falling into the sea. And so I lost this very valuable priory, and it has a huge effect on the finances of the monastery, from which it never truly recovers. And of course, the cell at Dunwich is abandoned. This is around 1331, so it holds on for as long as it can until it literally falls off a cliff. Now, we have a couple of other interesting monasteries founded in the years after the conquest. We have Creating St Olave, founded in 1087 as a cell of the French Abbey of Bernay. We have the one that I've just put on the screen here. We have a monastery at Clare. Now, this is an interesting one because rather like Bury, it starts out in the Anglo-Saxon period as a college of secular canons in the town of Clare. And then when the castle is built by the Clare family, they moved those secular canons into the castle keep. But they also eventually, in about 1090, they introduced Benedictines, or the secular canons become Benedictines. And so we have a small kind of castle chapel, if you like, that's staffed by the Benedictines. And Clare has a very curious history because it's a cell initially of the Abbey of Bec-Hellouin. But then it undergoes this transformation because not only do the secular clerks become Benedictines, but then the Benedictines move, and they end up moving to nearby Stoke by Clare. And then when the 100 Years' War happens, when you've got the alien priories being dissolved, the monks of Stoke by Clare, instead of deciding that they're going to become a cell of another monastery, or they're going to become independent, they decide to secularize. So they actually return to being the secular clerks that they previously were. And this is in 1415. And so a secular college is created at Stoke by Clare, possibly with some of the old monks staffing that college. But what's interesting about that is that the secular college is able to survive the dissolution of the monasteries. And in fact, it survives until the dissolution of the chantries and colleges in 1548. And it's probably most famous as being a center of disputation at the time of the Reformation, and for its warden being none other than Matthew Parker, who of course becomes a Protestant and ends up as the second Protestant Archbishop of Canterbury after Thomas Cranmer. So a very significant place in the religious history of Suffolk, but with this curiously checkered past stretching all the way back to the Anglo-Saxon period. Another curious example of a religious house, which in fact is in direct rivalry with one of the others, is Hoxton Priory. Hoxton Priory is founded in about 1130, and that's a cell of Norwich Cathedral Priory. And Hoxton Priory claims to be built on the site where St Edmund was originally buried. Historically, it's complete nonsense. There's actually no connection between Hoxton and the martyrdom of St Edmund. But it was a persistent medieval myth that there was. And this is the house that's standing on the site of Hoxton Priory today. But Hoxton sets itself up as a rival pilgrimage site with the Abbey of Bury St Edmunds, at one point even claiming that it's got the body of St Edmund, who was never translated to Bury St Edmunds, and it's all a fake. And it goes back to this rivalry between Bury and Norwich, which goes back to the 1080s, when Baldwin is building this enormous abbey church at Bury. Herfast, Bishop of Norwich, is building what's now Norwich Cathedral, this enormous Norman church at Norwich, and they're trying to build a bigger church. And the reason that Herfast has this beef with Bury is that he wanted his cathedral to be at Bury, and he wanted to make use of that splendid abbey church, and Baldwin was having none of it. And so to get his revenge, Herfast builds this enormous church at Norwich, trying but failing to make it bigger than the one at Bury St Edmunds, and it establishes this pilgrimage site at Hoxton directly as a rival with Bury St Edmunds. So it's a strange one because it's largely based on pilgrim revenue. It's not a house that exists off its income from lands or anything else. It's exclusively, it exists to attract pilgrims and trying to get them to come to the two chapels that were located on the site of the burial of the body of St Edmund and the site of the burial of the head of the discovery of the head of St Edmund. So there were two chapels in Hoxton. Let's turn now to the nuns, because I haven't said anything about female religious. The Benedictine nuns don't arrive until a little bit later. So it's not until 1160 that we have 1120 that we have the foundation of Redlingfield, although the one that I've shown here is Bungay. Bungay is a rather special place because you can see, if you look carefully, just behind the ruined chancel of the church, you can see just the top of the baptistry of St Edmund's Church, the 19th century Catholic church, which is the Benedictine church today, that is until this year. And therefore you've got this site which has seen a great deal of Benedictine continuity, the Benedictine nuns there up until the dissolution. And then you've got the reappearance of the Benedictines in the 1820s, although they've been around there for a lot longer And I'll say a bit about that in a moment. So what happened to all these monasteries? Well, as I've mentioned, we have a number of dissolutions in the 1520s, beginning in 1525, when Cardinal Wolsey is founding two institutions. First of all, Cardinal College in Oxford, and secondly, his college in Ipswich. Cardinal College in Oxford, of course, is founded, becomes Christ Church. The college in Ipswich is a bit of a damp squib. It is founded, but then almost immediately dissolved as a result of Wolsey's downfall. So all his grand plans for Ipswich come to nothing. And the money was spaffed on these other projects of his. There were also some dissolutions in favour of Eton College. So we've got some dissolutions happening even earlier under Henry VI, where monastic houses deemed useless, monastic houses that were had usually 2 or 3 members that were no longer considered economically viable, they are dissolved for the benefit of Eton College. And then, of course, we have the major dissolutions beginning in 1535, 1536. Again, it's those houses with an income of less than £300 per annum, which, of course, leaves the only ones that are left by 1539, after the dissolution of the friaries in 1538. We have Bury St Edmunds, and we have a couple of Cluniac houses, and Brewsyard Abbey, which is poor Clare. Brewsyard and the Cluniac houses seem to have bribed Thomas Cromwell to leave them for a little bit longer, but of course it was in vain, and Bury is dissolved on the 4th of December 1539, which leaves it as the last remaining house. And that appears to be the end of monasticism in Suffolk. But in fact, one of the earliest men to join a continental Benedictine house, in fact, I believe the earliest, a man called Robert Sayer, is a Suffolk man. He comes from Redgrave, the home of the Bacon family, who were ironically the hereditary stewards of the Abbey of Bury St Edmunds and of West Suffolk. And he joins the Benedictines in 1589. The return of the Benedictines to Suffolk, it may well be that the first Benedictine to come back was actually none other than Sigebert Buckley, who of course was the crucial monk of the refounded Westminster Abbey, who provides that link between the refounded Westminster Abbey under Queen Mary and the foundation of the English Benedictine congregation, or the re-establishment of the English Benedictine congregation in 1606, when you've got the foundation of St Gregory's and the earliest continental houses. Now, Sigebert Buckley, we know, was imprisoned in Framlingham Castle. And of course, in Framlingham Castle, he would have had the freedom to celebrate Mass. That was usually something that the priests managed to do. And he wasn't released from there until 1606. And as soon as he's released, that's when he goes to Westminster and ends up being found in his rooms by those 3 monks who are clothed by him to continue the lineage of the Benedictines in England. So there's a Suffolk connection. But in terms of the missionary Benedictines, the earliest that we know of who turns up in Suffolk is a man called William Palmer, who is present at Hintlesham Hall in 1622. We don't know how long he stayed, but he was chaplain to the Timperley family, who were a small recusant family, but clients of the Duke of Norfolk. The Dukes of Norfolk and Earls of Arundel, of course, exercised a great deal of influence both in Norfolk and Suffolk right throughout the early modern period. But it's not until 1657 that we get something more like permanent Benedictine presence, when we have the arrival of Father Walgrave at Flixton Hall. Flixton Hall located very close to Bungay, up in the northeast corner of Suffolk. And that may have been a flash in the pan. Walgrave falls to his death from the stairs of Flixton Hall a few years later. But it just so happens that the Taesborough family of Flixton become very attached to the Benedictines. And by the early 18th century, it has become established that the chaplain at Flixton should be a Benedictine. At that time, you have laws in place, which means that it's not possible to fund a chaplain simply from your own funds. It's necessary to establish a trust if you want that chaplaincy to continue. And the Taesboroughs were quite far-sighted in this, in that while most chaplains were entirely dependent on the goodwill of whether the person, the head of the family, happened to be Catholic, because you couldn't guarantee that that would necessarily continue. The Taysboroughs thought that they would establish this on a more permanent footing, so they set up a trust specifically to support the chaplain. And this happens as early as 1704 and is formalized in the 1730s. And so even if the Taysborough family dies out, that chaplaincy will continue in a cottage in the village of Flixton. And in fact, that's what happens. The Taysboroughs do die out, but the chaplaincy continues as an established Benedictine mission. And eventually what that turns into is the Benedictines deciding with their endowment at Flixton that they're going to move to the greater centre of population nearby. And so they moved to Bungay, and in 1823, a permanent church is established in Bungay, which in fact is the first freestanding open Catholic church that's built in Suffolk since the Reformation. And this is a number of years before Catholic emancipation. And so that church is eventually in the 1890s replaced by the wonderful church of St Edmund that is there today in Bungay. But Flixton, although it's the mission that we probably know the best of the early modern Benedictine missions, is not the only one. We have a long-running mission at Stoke Ash in the middle of Suffolk towards the northern part, which runs between 1715 and 1759. So a long-running mission there. We also have a mission at Hengrave Hall near Bury St Edmunds, which runs from 1720 to 1741. And the Benedictine monks there, because of the death of the priest, the secular priest in Bury, they end up having to move to Bury and take over the mission there. And so they're there from 1741 to 1755. And when those two priests finally die, the mission is taken over by the Jesuits, who build the big church of St Edmund, King and Martyr in Bury St Edmunds on Westgate Street. And so Bury now, is very much known as having been a Jesuit mission and has got that heritage. But in fact, if you look a little bit further back in the history to the 18th century, it was a Benedictine mission. And one of my favorite documents, which I need to get round to editing one of these days, is a diary that was kept by one of those Benedictine priests of all the stuff that was going on in Bury in the 1740s and 1750s. And it's a remarkable document, although like many Catholic documents of the period, it hides its true identity. So he's pretending to be a schoolmaster and writing about, various things happening, which is obviously, people coming to mass or him celebrating mass, but he can't openly say that. So if somebody finds the diary, it can be interpreted as completely innocuous. And so you have to kind of read between the lines of some of this stuff. So yeah, Bury St Edmunds, 1741 to 1755. So a lot of Benedictines in 18th century Suffolk. But let's move on to another, I listed there some of the threats to the survival of monasteries. Let's move on to, some of these other ones. So we've got East Bergholt, and that of course is the nuns. The nuns of Brussels, the Benedictine nuns of Brussels, which was founded in the Monastery of the Glorious Assumption of the Blessed Virgin Mary, founded in 1598, so one of the earliest of the Benedictine houses of nuns. They end up moving to East Bergholt, having been in various other places, in 1857. And that's established as a major monastery in East Bergholt Hall until 1945, when the nuns leave, and then it's taken over by the Franciscans. During that time, there's a famous scandal where an ex-nun claimed that she had been imprisoned in the monastery and managed to escape. And this becomes a best-selling book in which she tells her story about how she was held captive by these nuns. And this is a kind of an anti-Catholic trope of the 19th and 20th century, the imprisoned nun story, which the nuns of East Bergholt strenuously defend their role in this. And in fact, she was not prevented from leaving, but there's a dramatic chase to the railway station, according to the book. It's quite entertaining, in fact, if you enjoy that kind of thing. But yes, East Bergholt comes to an end in the middle of the 20th century, and the nuns move elsewhere. But we also have the establishment of another Benedictine parish at Beccles in 1898. This is an offshoot of Bungay, but now is, of course, a separate parish. And the construction there of a remarkable building, which is St Bennettminster, one of my favorite modern Suffolk churches. I think it's underappreciated how incredible this building is. It's neo-Romanesque, It's one of my favorite architectural revival styles, also another thing that's unappreciated. But it's huge, and it was built with the intention of being a minster. So I think that the Downside had these plans that it was going to establish a proper cell, a priory at Beccles, and it never happens. The Downside doesn't have the resources. The diocese of Northampton, as then was, which covered East Anglia, was not really willing to give it support because it didn't have it's always been a very, very poor diocese, didn't have the resources, and so that idea was pulled, and it simply remains a parish church. But it's a remarkable example of a Benedictine architecture, which I think celebrates that incredible monastic tradition that Suffolk's got. And I think it's also worth mentioning that there's another group of Benedictines in Suffolk who are not as well known, but they are Benedictine religious sisters, the sisters, Benedictine Sisters of Grace and Compassion, at a little place called Montana outside Great Barton. And they are unsung heroes within the Bury St Edmunds area because they run a care home for the elderly, and they look after quite a few priests in that community. But they follow the rule of St Benedict, and occasionally you will see them around the town of Bury St Edmunds. But they also deserve a mention as Benedictines who are there to this day, witnessing to St Benedict's rule in Suffolk. But I'm going to wrap it up there, as I'm conscious that you may want to ask some questions, and no doubt there I'll be able to expand on some things that I haven't been able to say so much about. But thank you very much.
Thank you, Francis. That was absolutely fascinating, and I'm sure there will be some questions. If does anybody want to unmute themselves and fire away? No questions?
Or if there's anything that you'd like me to expand on.
You were mentioning the founding this the Great Royal Abbey. So I've seen Westminster sort of compared to St Denis as as being a deliberate Great Royal Foundation intended to be. Would the distinction have been as obvious then? I mean, did Bury retain a strong connection to the royal family?
Yeah, absolutely. And I think that Bury could be spoken of as being an English Saint Denis in exactly the same way that as Westminster. Westminster just benefited from the fact that it was geographically closer to the royal palace where the king was a lot of the time. And what you don't have in Bury is you don't have a royal palace. So again, Winchester, Hyde Abbey, places like that, they're right next to major royal palaces, and so benefit from that. But Bury is consciously founded on the model of Saint Denis. When you look at the arrangement of the Anglo-Saxon churches under Abbot Baldwin, he seems to be turning it into a kind of Saint Denis. So yeah, I think it never quite attains the status of a permanent royal foundation, which is tragic in a way, because if it had a stronger association with the monarchy, and it already had a pretty strong association, but had there been a royal palace there or something like that, then probably it wouldn't have been destroyed. And I suspect it might have turned into some kind of collegiate church like Westminster Abbey. But that's it's a fascinating might have been. It was on the cusp of being significant enough for Henry VIII to preserve it, because there's a story that he thought about preserving it because his sister was buried there. And thought about turning it into a cathedral, but never did. So it almost survived, but didn't quite.
Could I just ask you about the finances and how these huge buildings were supported financially, how they were created? Because they are big investments.
Yeah, that's a really good question. Yeah, I haven't really said much about the finances. It's a complex matter, and the finances of monasteries can be very elaborate indeed. But essentially, all of these monasteries had endowments of land, and so it was an expensive business. If you wanted to found a monastery, generally you would be somebody who was in the very much the upper echelons of society. And in the case of Bury St Edmunds, the endowment of lands was absolutely enormous, to the point that the Abbey actually owned lands in Normandy. It managed to reverse the trend, where mostly it was English abbeys being owned by Norman abbeys, that Bury St Edmunds actually went the other way and owned bits of Normandy. But that was exceptional. In most cases, you would have a founder who was a noble founder, who would give the monastery part of their own lands, and that was, of course, to secure the welfare of their soul. Yeah, it's an expensive option, and because it's such an expensive option, what you end up with is, by the 14th century, people are going for slightly cheaper ways to ensure the welfare of their soul by founding a chantry college or something like that, which doesn't have the same extensive requirement for an endowment of lands, because you've essentially got there just a group of priests whose only function is to be saying masses. Whereas a monastery, it's got many other functions. You know, it's going to have its own farms, it's going to have its own administration, and you know, monks of that era were, to a large extent, they would have led their lives as professional administrators, punctuated by prayer. And so you've got that aspect. You've also got the pilgrimage aspect, but the pilgrimage aspect is a bit more fickle. It's certainly not something that a monastery could rely on. Fashions changed over time. If you've got someone really, really famous like St Edmund, who is an incorrupt saint, very rare thing, then you're going to have pilgrims, and there's a consistent flow of pilgrims. But even then, someone else might come along, St Thomas Becket comes along, takes your pilgrims away. And so you end up with these other shrines becoming popular. Towards the end of the period before the dissolution, you've got Marian shrines becoming popular, Marian images, miraculous images. And so Bury, for example, decides, well, we're going to set one up of our own at Woolpit. And so you've got Our Lady of Woolpit competing with Our Lady of Walsingham, but Walsingham is proving a big draw, bigger than St Edmund by the end. So you've got that danger. And places like Hoxton, well, that's again set up on this kind of basis of pilgrim money. And Hoxton seems to have been quite successful, but it was a tricky business. It was a much more kind of cutthroat commercial business to be in, the business of pilgrimage, than relying on endowments. Or you relied on the support of your mother house. So if you were a cell, then your mother house might give you some support, or they might not. They might just pull the plug and say, well, actually, no, we're not interested in you anymore. We're going to sell you off, or we're going to cut you loose. So, yeah, I mean, I think we think of monasteries as being tremendously stable institutions. And of course they are, from the point of view of the historian. The wonderful thing from the historian's point of view is that a monastery is like a living person who continues their life over centuries. The institution, the community, the conventus is a living being and has this wonderful continuous history, which makes it great for a historian to study it. But I think we also have to acknowledge the threats that a monastery faced. And it was not an easy business to keep a monastery afloat. And it was not an easy business to keep a monastery continuously successful over centuries. So yeah, thank you.
I wonder if you could say something about specifically the downside Bungay connection. What prompted that connection?
Yeah, there's a great book on this by Edward Cruzet, which it goes into a great deal of detail about the connection with downside. My specialism is really not the 19th century, so I can't say very much in detail about how the connection with downside came about. But the 18th century aspect I've written on, and what you had there was originally the connection was actually with St Edmunds. Which was then, of course, in Paris, now at Dowie in Berkshire. So the original connection was because a member of the family, Felix Tasborough, he becomes a monk of St Edmunds, and he makes that endowment, that trust, to support Benedictine missionary priest. And originally, the trust document says that it is preferred that this monk should be a monk of St Edmunds, but that's not something that continues. And over time, it devolves to St Gregory's, as I understand it. And then because it's devolved to St Gregory's, when St Gregory's ends up moving to Acton Burnell and then eventually to Downside, it becomes established that it is a Downside connection. But I'm a little bit hazier, I have to admit, on the later history, because I don't really do the 19th century.
Thanks, great.
There was a picture you put up of St George's, Venice. Was there an English connection there? Yeah, the reason I put that up is because that was the church to which Gregory Sayer, Robert Gregory Sayer, he ends up going, and he takes the name and religion of Gregory and becomes a great moral theologian and establishes St George's in Venice as being the centre of Benedictine moral theology. So that, yeah, that's the reason why I had that there.